ating mga taga-subaybay. Ito na naman po isa na namang araw para sa talakayang Toti Speaks. Ang ating paksa sa araw po na ito ay tungkol po sa teritoryo dito sa ating bansa. Partikular na dito po sa may South China Sea o ating tinutuguriang West Philippine Sea. At itong sinasabahan ng ating tinatawagan ng UNCLOS o United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Bago natin simulan ito, pakinggan po natin itong video na iginawa po ng ulat galing po sa Al Jazeera patungkol po dito sa West Philippine Sea.
The fight over the South China Sea. It's talk Let's talk about the fight over the South China Sea. It's rich in oil and gas, there are loads of fish, and the shipping lanes are some of the busiest in the world. China wants control of it.
坚持以对话弥合分歧，以谈判化解争端。我们不追求一枝独秀。
But other countries say they have rights to it too. And the Americans, well, they have trade routes through there worth hundreds of billions of dollars.
The U.S. has been committed to the idea of freedom of the seas, and nowhere is that under greater threat than in the South China Sea.
So what's behind China's claim over these waters? Why won't it share? And could it all lead to war? China has been a land-based power for millennia, so it's never had much of a navy, not like the colonial powers, nor has China needed one until now. Today, China wants to be a naval force across two oceans, the Indian and the Pacific. That's to make sure it can trade with the rest of the world and get enough oil and gas to drive its economy. And to do that, Beijing wants to control the South China Sea. But there's a lot of competition. Taiwan, for one, claims many of the same rights that China does. Then there's Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. They want to protect their turf, whether it's rights to islands, seabed oil, or fishing grounds. Indonesia's in there too, and the Americans, they want to protect those valuable shipping lanes. So no shortage of players. The question is, how is this all going to be resolved?
There are three futures for the South China Sea. The one that it looks headed toward now is, of course, China will just get Southeast Asian countries to sigh and accept its claims. The one that everybody really wants to avoid is a conflict.
And then there's the third option, which involves pushing some kind of compromise between China and its neighbors. Countries like Taiwan and others that are members of ASEAN have tried. But no one expects that to go anywhere anytime soon, because China knows what it wants, and it's been working towards that for a long time. We're talking about China's 9-dash line. Back in 1929, the Chinese took a bunch of old British sailing charts and told cartographers to draw China's borders. One of them drew 9 dashes around the entire South China Sea. And as far as the Chinese were concerned, that was that.
Over the last 70 plus years, the line's taken on a life of its own. And in Beijing, at least, the meaning has steadily expanded so that today, China's not just claiming the islands inside it, it's claiming all the waters, all the seabed, all the airspace.
So then in 2013, China added a 10th line to take in Taiwan. Its appetite seems to be growing. It's easy enough to understand why China wants control when you look at the numbers. Around 40% of the world's liquefied natural gas passes through the South China Sea, from the Gulf, through the Indian Ocean, and onto places like China. The amount of trade that sails through there is worth $3 trillion a year, 1/3 of the world total.
Being able to control this waterway, what we normally call sea lines of communication, is extremely important for China.
So there's an expression in Latin that goes, if you want peace, prepare for war. Now, China has no immediate interest in war, but it wants to ensure its access to the South China Sea if it comes to that. In the west, the main shipping lane from the Indian Ocean narrows to just 3 kilometers, and it's surrounded by American allies. In the east, there's Taiwan, which has tons of American weapons and could block China from getting to the Pacific. So to help stake its territorial claim, China has planted its flag on contested islands that are in those waterways. In the Paracels, China's built a bunch of outposts, while in the Spratlys, it's added over 13 square kilometers of reclaimed land since 2013 and turned them into military bases.
The militarization of the South China Sea has grown rapidly over the last 5, 6, 7 years. It has come to a point where it's unacceptable for the United States.
It may be unacceptable to the Americans, but neither the Obama nor the Trump administrations are seen to have accomplished much. The US's main way of asserting navigational rights and freedoms is having its navy sail through the South China Sea. It also conducts military exercises in the region, sometimes with warships from France, Japan, and Australia in the Bay of Bengal. In July, things got a bit hairy. The Chinese and Americans both held naval exercises in the South China Sea.
Worsening tensions between China and the United States.
The U.S. sailed in with 2 aircraft carrier strike groups.
It's the first time Washington sent 2 carriers for drills in the area since 2014.
And the Chinese accused the Americans of escalating things. Before the U.S. elections, the Trump team gave it one last shot, with mixed results.
Don't let the Chinese Communist Party walk over us. You should have confidence that America will be here in friendship to help you.
美国才是本地区和平稳定的破坏者和麻烦制造者。
What everyone's been trying to do is get China to obey the law, namely the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The law establishes what are called exclusive economic zones. These extend 200 nautical miles out from a country's coastline, regardless of whether it's the mainland or an island. And China signed up to that law.
All of the world came together, including China, in the 1970s and negotiated the current regime of maritime law, which says everybody gets the same set of maritime claims. China's claims don't fit within that framework.
So the Philippines did the only thing it could. It took China to court. One of the big issues was fishing rights.
For millions of Filipinos living in coastal communities like this one, food security is at the heart of the South China Sea dispute.
In 2013, the Philippines argued that China had no right to the Scarborough Shoal. It filed a case against the Chinese with an international tribunal at The Hague.
China! China! China!
Judges ended up siding with the Philippines. Remember China's territorial claim based on that 9-dash line? Well, in 2016, the court concluded that it's invalid.
When after China lost a landmark arbitration case before the Philippines, Beijing realized that the best way to divert attention from that and avoid diplomatic blowback would be to show some progress.
Since the 1990s, ASEAN, that association of South Asian countries, has tried to cobble together a code of conduct for the South China Sea. The idea was to control China's ambitions. China hadn't shown much interest in a code back then, but after losing the case with the Philippines, the Chinese started to push for one, though some in ASEAN questioned China's motives.
Honestly and unfortunately, I don't think there is any fertile ground for reaching an agreement.
It's not trying to solve anything, right? The Code of Conduct will not say who owns what rock. It won't say whose maritime claims go where. It's meant to manage dispute.
There's another problem. Not everyone in ASEAN is eager to offend a country as powerful as China.
Certain members of the grouping, particularly Cambodia, but also Laos, at times Thailand, have really no desire to irritate China. And so this means a whole heck of a lot to 4 of the members, 5 maybe, and almost nothing to the other 5. And that's a recipe for no progress.
Vietnam has repeatedly butted heads with China over their competing claims.
The last time there was a real talk was in Dalat, Vietnam, and the Vietnamese delegation blew up the whole process because they were so angry over recent harassment of oil and gas operations by China that had gone on at the same time. So they'll say that there's progress. I would encourage everybody to take that with a giant grain of salt.
This year's ASEAN summit was hosted by Vietnam, and a lot of it by video because of the pandemic. But the social distancing wasn't expected to help delegates reach any agreements on the South China Sea.
We express serious concern over ongoing developments that infringe on the lawful rights of littoral countries.
The problem with the South China Sea is that it's vast and the stakes are high. There are a lot of heavily armed countries defending their interests there. And China's Coast Guard, as well as Chinese militia using fishing boats, often cause confrontations on the open sea. Many analysts worry about all of that provoking a military response from someone. But strangely enough, the whole dispute also sort of just bubbles away under the radar.
The South China Sea is so insidious. It is hard to keep attention on it, not just within Washington, but all of the other global partners and allies. Somebody is always going to be distracted or find it not all that important.
The Chinese see the South China Sea as essential to their survival. Thing is, it's important to everyone there. That's why this whole dispute isn't going away. But China's been around for thousands of years. If anyone's good at playing the long game, it's China.
Diyan po natin maririnig na sinabi po nitong ulat na to na mismo ang China ay mayroong katagalan na dito sa ating lugar mahigit 1,000 taon. Kaya nga tayo nga ngayon ay problema kung kakayanin ba natin tapatan itong dambuhalang or mahiganteng karatig bayan na mismo tayo hindi natin kakayanin. Ito po ay nagbuo ng isang maikling ulat at makita po natin ano ang naging response ng ating bansa. Next slide please. Tumugon na ating pamalaan at sinabi nga nila na sila ay balak magtayo ng infrastruktura dito sa West Philippine Sea. Next slide. Next slide, please. Ayon po kay Major General Arevalo, next slide, nung siya na-interview kamakailan itong Biyernes sa stasyon ng Double B, na ang balak lang nila ay magsilbing mungkahi lang nitong binuo ng National Task Force on the West Philippine Sea, na inaantay nila ng isang magandang solusyon. At ang kanilang proposal ay magtayo lang ng isang parang infrastructure dyan sa may para lang itugunan ang pangailangan ng maritime and sovereign rights of the country. Ganon pa man ang karapatan ng ating mangingisda at ang kaligtasan ng mga tumatawid sa karagatan nito. Next slide. Dagdag pa niya na ilan sa mga struktura na itong sinasadya ng ating armed forces ay magtayo lang ng mga fisherman shelters or pang silong lang sa ating mga mangingisda. At tinitingnan nila kung maaari sila maglagay ng mga cold storage facilities at ganoon din yung lighthouses or yung mga tinatawag natin na lampara para sa karagatan. Ano? At hindi naman ito pang dirigma, kundi ito ay pagbibigay ng kaligtasan sa ating mga mangingisda. At nung tinanong siya kung kailangan pa ba magtayo ng mga military headquarters dito sa West Philippine Sea, ang sagot niya na ang Philippine Marines daw ay tuluyan daw gumagawa ng pagpapatrol sa mga siyam na isla diyan sa paligid na yan para lang magkaroon ng madali ang pagsisilom ng ating mga mangingisda o mga pupunta sa karagatan. Dagdag pa nga niya na mismo ang China ay nagpupumilit na may-ari ng buo nitong South China Sea at hindi niya pinupuna ang naging solusyon ng haton nitong Permanent Court of Arbitration noong nakaraang taon 2016, ang buwan ng Hulyo, nang nagsampa ng kaso ang bansang Pilipinas. Ayon nga dito sa ulat na to na ang Pilipinas ay nagsampa ng diplomatic protest dahil nga doon sa mga tinuguriang mga presensya ng mga Chinese vessels dito sa naka-questionabling lupain na dapat po ay nasa teritoryo ng ating bansang Pilipinas. Ayon po dito sa Chinese ambassador sa ating bansa, na tinutukoy nila itong pangailangan na ito na bagamat ito ay tungkol sa mga presensya dito sa mga Chinese boats nandiyan sa may Julian Felipe Reef. At tuluyan pa rin nilang hindi pinapansin ang arbitral ruling na pumapabor sa ating bansa sa pag-aangkin sa mga isla dito sa tinaguriang West Philippine Sea. Dahil meron itong kasaysayan sa mga nakaraang taon ng ating mga... Ito naman po, next slide please. Ito naman po ay papakinggan po naman natin ang haka-haka ng dating ASEAN Special Representative of the Philippines sa ang dating former ambassador na si Rosario G. Manalo. Pakinggan po natin ang kanyang punto vista patungkol dito sa arbitration na ginanap sa laban nito.
I hope I am not branded as a traitor to the country. But if you study very carefully international law, an arbitration was not set up correctly when we claim our right to the Kalayaan group of islands. I was breaking my brains trying to find out from international law books authorities what is an arbitration tribunal. And everywhere, an arbitration tribunal calls for three parties. The two who are claiming whatever they're claiming, and between the two, the selection of an umpire. And when arbitration is carried out, it is always voluntary. Under the UN Charter, it is always voluntary. However, in the UNCLOS, there was a provision or an attachment or something that made arbitration as a mechanism for solving compulsory under the UNCLOS. But the Philippines, when we ratified and approved the UNCLOS, we opted out of that provision, which means hindi natin gagamitin yung compulsory arbitration. We just didn't want it. All right. Without even us talking with the Chinese or wherever, equally the same, the Chinese opted out of that provision. So, both the Philippines and China cannot invoke compulsory arbitration under the UNCLOS because we both opted out. So, what is the remedy? Dalhin natin sa UN. Under the UN Charter, which is voluntary arbitration. Philippines wanted it. Ayaw ng China. Voluntary. They say, you cannot tell China, "Hoy, you have to do it." Because, no, it's voluntary. So what did we do? We went and proceeded to set up an arbitration panel. That is not even an arbitration panel. That's just a Philippine panel handpicking the people who will render the very issue that we want at binabayaran nyo ng panahon nila. Ikaw ba naman kung babayaran ka at andun ka, hindi ba bibigay mo yung favorable position? That is why China is questionable. Now, I'm not trying, please understand, I'm not trying to be traitor to my country. I love my country. Pero hindi tama. Sino may sulsul nyo? Kayo nang draw the conclusion, ano? However, the very fact that that decision was given, it has brought to the attention of the world that we have a basis to do some claiming on the South China Sea of the KGI. Pero it does not bind anybody. It's just a position taken by the Philippines, and with the arguments we're giving, ito importante at bakit importante sa atin sa Pilipinas. But that's, to me, an opinion of a plus for us. But it does not bind China nor anybody else in the world. Ngayon, kung magkakaroon tayo ng new process of settling the issue, we will. Kaya, in this point, tama si Presidente Duterte. Tabi muna yan, at the proper time, ilalabas natin.
What about the mechanism for bilateral negotiation?
Yun na nga, bilateral na.
Ito na yun.
Ito na yun, China and the Philippines.
Walang makikialam.
Wala nang makikialam. Unless, we invite others na makialam.
It was an idea of the previous administration to have a multilateral approach to the problem because of other claimants.
Eh, maraming gustong makialam eh.
At papakialamin
Yun
naman
lang.
natin.
Yung maraming makikialaman, meron nga. Ito pinakamalaki yung makikialaman.
Okay.
Balik po tayo sa ating slide. Narinig po natin dito kay Ambassador Rosario Manalo na dahil mismo ang ating bansa ay hindi nakibihagi sa una dito sa arbitration at ganoon din ang bansang China. Ngayon, bumalik tayo. Kaya nga tuloy, sino naging final judge ito? Kung kapag sinabi mong arbitration, dapat yung dalawang nagtatalunan ay present. Eh problema, ang China lang. Next slide please. So dito nga, nakita mo dito sa China Sea Arbitration, ito ay isang ulat ginawa nung taon na 2016. Sabi nga dito, next slide, na ang binubuo nito ay ang article or yung annex, Annex 7 of the UNCLOS for the declaratory judgment to the effect that China rejected the arbitral procedure in part because of its 2006 declaration, which excludes all such disputes from the compulsory settlement procedure of the convention. Yan po yung sa Annex 7. Kung titingnan po natin yung Article 7, next slide. Dito nakalagay dito na meron tayo doon sa Article 7 ng UNCLOS na meron sila tawag nilang straight baselines. So in localities where the coastline is deeply indented and cut into, or if there is a fringe of islands along the coast in its immediate vicinity, the method of straight baselines joining appropriate points may be employed in drawing the baseline from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured. Kasi nga meron tayong tinatawag na yung mga economic exclusive zone at meron sinasabi na meron siyang layo na habot ng 200 nautical miles. Kaya nga, nagsasapawan ito at hindi lang ang bansang Pilipinas ang umaangkin, kundi ang iba-ibang mga bansa pa. Next slide. Ang UNCLOS, para sa ating kapakanan ng ating mga sumusubaybay, ay ang tinatawag yan, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, also called the Law of the Sea Convention or the Law of Sea Treaty. Ito ay isang kasunduan ng pandaigdig na ginanap noong UN Conference on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS 3, no, na naganap itong sa taon 1973 at noong 1982. Ayon dito sa conference na ito ay piniliwanag nila ang mga karapatan at responsibilidad ng bawat bansa ayon sa paggagamit ng world's ocean at pagtataguyod ng mga patakaran para sa kalakalan o negosyo at yung kanyang kapiligiran, environment, at ganoon din po ang pangangasiwa at pamamahala sa yaman ng karagatan or yung marine natural resources. Ito po ay nagtapos noong 1982 at pinalitan niya yung Quad Treaty of the 1958 Convention of the High Seas at ito po ay pinatupad or simula na noong 1994. Makaraan ng isang taon, makalipas ng ang Guyana ang mismong pinaka-60 bansa na nagratifika nitong treaty. So kung titignan mo, kung nangyari ito nung natapos ito ng 1982 sa ating bansa, yan pa yung bago pa lang tayo, bago pa nakabalik pa nga si Ninoy dito sa ating bansa. Pero nung ito ipinatupad na ng 1994, ito po ay sa pangangasiwa, sa pamamahala ni Pangulong Ramos na. No? Pero malala nyo, sometime in the 1970s, 1980s, si mismo Pangulong Marcos ay nagbibigay ng pansin patungkol dito sa Spratly Islands. Kaya nga nung ika-26 or ang taon ng 2000 at 16 itong buwan ng Hunyo, may mga 167 countries na nakibahagi na dito sa UNCLOS, kasama na dyan ang European Union. Ito yung kanilang website kung gusto nyo maghanap ng mga mga nilalaman nitong batas na ito. At ito po ang isa pong dalubhasa na talagang eksperto patungkol dito sa mga nangyari sa mga alitan noon pa lang noong 1973, 1968 hanggang sa kasalukuyan. Maganda po nating bisitahin ito. Ito po ay binuo ng isang talakay kamakailan na makinggan po natin ang talakayan ni Diplomat Ambassador to the United Nations si Alberto Encomienda na naging ambassador din sa Malaysia, na meron siyang dagdag kaalaman sa London and Columbia University patungkol po sa maritime and ocean affairs. Pakinggan po natin itong usapin na ito sa kanyang nakapanayam sa isang talakayan.
Now, when it was said that I was involved on the ground in these issues, yes, I was there, but I must, okay, just for the sake of shall we say, accuracy, I was a member of the Philippine delegation to the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS 3, but I was not involved in the negotiations. I was secretary to the delegation, but I did learn a lot. I was pushing papers and these things, and that is what also where I got involved in further studies in international law, as law of the sea, as Austin mentioned earlier. I sought to be enrolled at the University of London in 1971. Simply because that was in fact also the first time that a higher studies on the law of the sea was ever offered from any university in the world. And besides, England having ruled the seas before is key to establishing customary international law of the sea. But processing the UNCLOS, which had 3 stages, it was done first. Well, the Harvard School of Law started with a restatement. It was their own work of how they interpreted customary international law. This was a next step to this is the International Law Commission before the General Assembly actually began pushing for the conference itself. Now, the conference itself, which is about further development of international law, is in fact mandated in the Charter of the United Nations. It is called progressive development. So, UNCLOS 1 was about customary international law. It was not too difficult to assemble. There was quite easy convergence of views in customary international law. After all, it was not all that extensive at the time, which was then being considered. But in regard to progressive development of international law, that was more difficult because the entire, shall we say, membership of the United Nations, plus a few other countries who are not members of the United Nations, like Switzerland, were there. And now, why is it important? Why is UNCLOS important to us? Number one, we are a maritime nation and a coastal state and an archipelagic state. Now, in these 3 descriptions, we have a big stake as a state, as an archipelagic state in the law of the sea. Why? First, it is in UNCLOS that we were able to secure our status as an archipelagic state. It is a different regime from all other categories of states, and the Philippines was the one who pushed for the adoption of the archipelagic state under UNCLOS, and we were the first ones there. We were backstopped strongly by Indonesia and a few others, but in the end, there are now about 16 or 17 archipelagic states in the world. This is a separate category of statehood. Obviously, archipelagic state means being a coastal state also. Now, again, why is this important to us? You look at the Philippines in the regional map of Asia Pacific, and the Philippines, straddle the north to south, practically enclosing the South China Sea. That's one thing. It's very strategic position. Number two, it is also very strategic in regard to protection of the marine environment and its resources. Don't forget that the Coral Triangle is practically 70% in the Philippines, okay? And of course, we have the Tobataha Reef that is farther to the west. Very, very strategic also in regard to resources, marine resources and the environment. Now, let me refine that concept of the archipelago. Yes, the archipelago is especially the archipelagic state, because not all archipelagos are archipelagic states. Japan is an archipelago, the United Kingdom is an archipelago, but they are not archipelagic states. The regime of the archipelagic state is in UNCLOS at part 4, but you have to subscribe to being one before you become officially an archipelagic state. So, digressing a bit, we have always been an archipelago. We have been called since the turn of the last century as the Philippine Islands, but the regime itself of the archipelagic state is very different, especially in terms of protecting our national interests as a coastal state and maritime state, very different from that of an ordinary island state. In UNCLOS, there is also the so-called regime of islands, part 5, I think. Now, an archipelago which has not declared itself an archipelagic state under UNCLOS part 4 will be governed by the so-called regime of islands, which means that each island or each marine geological feature will have its own entitlements, normal entitlements in terms of the territorial sea, or now we have the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf. What does this mean? And I want to go into this because that is exactly the core national interest of the Philippines. If that, we must give credit to Senator Tolentino having pushed it in the General Assembly of the United States, of the United Nations, and in the UNCLOS itself. He conceptualized and defined it. And that is now what is the regime of the archipelagic state under UNCLOS Part 4. Now, let me go back to what I was saying. An archipelago like Japan and the UK, who does not declare itself an archipelagic state, the maritime jurisdictions will be determined by the regime of islands. Now, if we did not declare ourselves an archipelagic state, or especially if we did not work for that status of an archipelagic state under UNCLOS, each and every island in the Philippines will generate its own territorial sea, and especially in the original reckoning before UNCLOS 3, in which at the time UNCLOS 1, the accepted territorial width of the territorial sea is only 3 nautical miles, following customary international law, then the Philippines will have so many pockets of high seas. What will that mean? That means the Philippines will be like a sieve where ships of other nations have the right to freely transit because it is high seas within an archipelagic state. So the concept of archipelagic state, as especially conceptualized and pushed by Senator Tolentino, and that is where and implemented unilaterally before UNCLOS through Republic Act 3046 and 5446, which defined our base points and baselines way back in the early 60s. Again,
Okay, so yan po ang pahayag ko nitong ating diplomat ambassador sa UNC, Alberto Comienda. Sinasabi pa nga niya, next slide please, na nagsasalubong ang iba-ibang mga nagke-claim dito sa ating teritoryo. Kaya nga, hindi lang po ang Pilipinas ang umaangkin. Meron din po dyan ang Malaysia, ang Brunei, ang Vietnam, ang China, at Taiwan. Kaya nga, doon naman sa medyo gawi sa ating teritoryo, mukhang pumapasok na sa ating lupain. Kaya nga, nandiyan na po sa ating teritoryo ang China. Nagtatayo na nga sila ng mga kung ano-anong mga port, ng mga pwesto. At dahil nga dyan, ay ito na ang pinagtatalo ng ilan sa ating mga mambabatas at ilan sa ating mga nag-aangkin na mali dapat. Kasi nga gaya na sinabi ko niyo sa nakaraang talakayan, ang ating bansa, ang ating pamahalaan ay tila pinahina ang ating militar. Hindi naman ang inyong lingkod ay pumapanig na na gawin nating mandirigma ang ating hukbong sandataan lakas, kundi patibayin at palakasin para hindi naman tayo basta-basta kaya nilang ibuli. Ngayon nga, ano ba ipagkaharap natin sa kanila? Kung hindi mga bangka, maalala yung panahon pa nga ni Pangulong Ramos, sumasalubog dito sa mga barkong karagatan ng China, ating mga bangka, samantalang sila, ang dala na nilang sasakyan ay talaga sasakyang pandigmaan na gawa sa bakal, talagang mukha naman tayong kawawanin. Pero ganoon pa man, na nandito tayo sa sitwasyon na ngayon, at buti naman at sa pangasiwa ni Pangulong Duterte at nakapagbili ng mga makabagong sasakyan pangkaragatan, kulang pa rin. At ito na nga siguro, binumungkahi ng ating Philippine Navy na dapat noon pa man, siguro nung 1986 pa man, mula pa lang nung napatalsik si Pangulong Marcos, hindi dapat binitawan ang pagbibigay ng pondo sa ating militar, no? Kung pinatutupad lang ni Pangulong Cory Aquino ang pagtuloy ng paggamit ng nitong Bataan Nuclear Power Plant, na alam natin, natalo rin tayo at natuloy na nagmulta tayo ng $2.6 billion, no? Dahil nga bilang penalty. Ngayon, eto na naman, wala na naman tayong panggastusin. Sayang din yun kung ating nakaraan, ginawa na lang sana ng itong mga mambabatas, ituloy ang paggamit ng ating Bataan Nuclear Power Plant. Hindi na siguro tayo nagkalintik-lintik nung katapusan ng kanyang termino ni Pangulong Cory Aquino. At dahil nga sa sunod-sunod ng ating at nagkaroon ng pagkukulang sa pagbibigay ng kuryente sa mga kalakalan nagtayo ng panahon na yun, binigyan ba naman ng emergency power si Pangulong Ramos, at dahil doon, naabuso naman at tuloy na privatize. Yun lang po ang ating ngayon. Sa susunod na slide. Next slide, please. Mapapakinggan naman po natin itong paliwanag po ni Supreme Court Justice Carpio patungkol po sa kasaysayan ng paano nangyari, ano ba ang nasa likod nitong West Philippine Sea. At ito po ay meron siyang ginawang pag-uulat ni Justice Antonio Carpio bilang isa sa mga tinaguriang eksperto siguro kung masasabi na natin ang nangyari at meron sa mga ginawa. Pakinggan po natin itong kanyang lecture.
Let's go back to a little bit of history. What happened in the South China Sea from 1946 to 2017? Before World War II, the southernmost territory of China was Hainan. Not a single Chinese sailor or soldier was stationed in the South China Sea, none in the Paracels, none in the Spratlys, none in Scarborough Shoal. So throughout the Chinese dynasties, the southernmost territory of China was Hainan. China never occupied any of the islands in the South China Sea. Now, when did China move out of the Hainan? Before World War II, just before World War II, the Japanese seized the Paracels from the French. The French occupied the Paracels at the time. And Japan also occupied Ituaba, the largest island in the Spratlys, and Japan put up a submarine base in Ituaba. That submarine base was used in the invasion of the Philippines. With the defeat of the Japanese forces, so the Japanese forces left the South China Sea, China made its move. In 1946, after the World War II, when the Japanese forces left the South China Sea, China seized half of the Paracels. The other half of the Paracels was recovered by the French and inherited by the South Vietnamese government. And also, in 1946, China seized Ituaba, that submarine base of the Japanese. So, China made a great leap in 1946 from Hainan to the Paracels and to the Spratlys. In 1974, towards the dying days of the Vietnam War, China seized the other half of the Paracels from the South Vietnamese government, which was very weak at the time already. There was a battle there, the Battle of the Paracels. In 1987, China put up a radar weather station on Fiery Cross Reef. In 1987, UNESCO was conducting a global oceanic survey, and China volunteered. China said, we will help UNESCO. We will put up a radar weather station on Fiery Cross Reef to help UNESCO. And it was a very noble act. Nobody objected. Everybody applauded China. Today, Fiery Cross Reef is an air and naval base of China. In 1988, China seized Subi Reef from the Philippines. We did not even notice it. It was not reported in the newspapers in Manila. We were not familiar then with the UNCLOS, but China seized Subi Reef. And at the same time, China seized Johnson South Reef from the Vietnamese, from the Communist Vietnamese, and there was a skirmish in the Johnson South Reef between the Vietnamese and the Chinese, and about 69 Vietnamese sailors were killed in that skirmish. 1995, China seized Mischief Reef from the Philippines. That was widely reported in the papers in Manila. 2012, China seized Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines, widely reported also. And 2013, China seized Lucuña Shoals from Malaysia. Lucuña Shoals is just 54 nautical miles from the coast of Sabah. 2015, 2016, China started building air and naval bases on its 7 geologic features in the Spratlys. China started reclaiming those geologic features, creating artificial islands. 2017, China seized Sandy Cay from the Philippines. China seized it by surrounding Sandy Cay with its maritime militia vessels, the same way that it seized Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. China surrounded it with their vessels, their Coast Guard vessels and their maritime vessels, and that's how they seized Sandy Cay from the Philippines. Sandy Cay is just 2 nautical miles from Pag-asa, our largest island in the Spratlys. But the Duterte administration is still in denial. the Duterte administration does not accept that or does not tell the Filipino people that we have lost Sandy Cay to the Chinese. So, if you look at this developments from 1946 to 2017, you will see a creeping expansion by China in the South China Sea. And that is exactly what happened from 1946 to 2017.
Okay. Diyan po napakinggan po natin ang paliwanag po ni Justice Antonio Carpio, ang kasaysayan kung dahan-dahan nga tayong pinapasukan ng bansang China sa ating teritoryo. At maliwanag po na sa mga nakaraang ilang taon o ilang dekada na wala talagang pagpapansin itong bansang China dahil kung maalala ninyo sa kasaysayan ng China ay kagagaling lang po nila sa isang revolusyon. Naging communist country po siya noong mga 1949 at panahon na yun medyo makagaluhan at wala po sila kakayanan mag-angkin sa mga teritoryo ng panahon na yun at medyo may kahinaan pa sila sa lakas sandatahan at ang makapangyarihan ng lakas sandatahan ng panahon na yun ay ang bansang Amerika. Pero hindi katulad ngayon na dahil nga bigla na subigla ang kanilang ekonomiya at meron silang kakayanan na makapasok na sa ating teritoryo, dahan-dahan na nila nagtatayo na sila ng mga kung ano ng mga gusali dito sa ating lugar. At paliwanag kanina ni Ambassador Encomienda, paliwanag niya na tatlong klaseng estado meron tayo, yung tinatawag na maritime nation. Itong maritime nation po ay yung bansa na may mga teritoryo sa dalampasigan na may mga dumadaloy ng mga mangingisda o anumang mga sasakyang pangkaragatan, pangkalahatan na malaya sila na tumawid. At meron din tayong tinatawag na coastal states, no? Yan po yung mga isla na ang kanilang teritoryo ay iilan lang dyan na nakapaligid lang sa kanila at pwede na silang magtayo ng sarili nilang republika, ika nga, no? Pero meron din tinasawag na archipelagic state. Ang archipelagic state ay namumuo sa katulad ng ating bansa na hindi lang tayo coastal or maritime, kundi archipelago dahil ang binubuo ng ating bansa ay maraming isla. Kaya nga ang bansang Pilipinas ay naiiba sa ibang mga bansa dahil maski archipelago nga sila, ang UK archipelago yan. Archipelago yan. Pero hindi lang ay ang bansang Pilipinas at ang bansang Indonesia. Pero yung mga iba, hanggang doon sa mga lugar na nila na malapit lang sa kanilang karagatan at pwede lang ituring yan na kanilang teritoryo. Pero dahil nga dito sa atin, unti-unting kinakain na po ng bansang China ang ating teritoryo. Pero kaya ba nating banggain ang bansang China? Kung babalikan po natin ang sitwasyon or iintindihin po natin ang sitwasyon dito sa bansang Vietnam na silang at saka bansang Taiwan. Sila talagang palaban yan. Talagang pag sila ay pagdating dito sa mga teritoryo at pakita ng mga lakas nila ay talagang parang silang matatapang ang kanilang alitan. Pero ganun pa man, hindi nila pwedeng talikuran ang pangangalakal ng dalawang bansa. Nilang dalawang bansa, magiging ng Vietnam at China o magiging ng Taiwan at ng China. At ganoon din tayo sa Pilipinas dahil malaki ang ating pangailangan at pag-aasa dito sa pangangalakal sa bansang China. Dahil kung wala ang China, isa na siya sa pinakamalaking bansa na tayo nagbebenta ng ating kakayanan, ng ating mga produkto. Kung ito'y lalabanan natin, baka mawala tayo ng ganitong kakayanan. Kaya nga, medyo delikado at masalimuot itong sitwasyon natin na wala tayong kakayanan na pumalag bilang isang bansa dahil una, hindi na ayon sa ating saligang batas, yan po ay hindi natin sinasakayunan. Ayaw po natin makipaglabanan sa kanino mang bansa kasi ang atin lang ay ating ipagtanggol lang ang ating teritoryo. At ganoon din po, nakalagay po sa ating saligang batas, talagang pinagbabawal natin ang mga armas nuklear na kumakalat dito sa ating teritoryo. Alam po natin, siguro itong mga naval ships na dumadaan sa atin, lalo-lalo na kung galing sa China o sa US, ay malamang ay kargado yan ng mga nuclear power arms. Dahil nga dyan, kailangan ang isa pong napag-aralan na natutunan natin pagdating dyan sa mga foreign policy, dapat nga itong mga pangailangan, itong ating patutupad na ito, ay dapat nakatatag yan sa ating saligang batas. Kaya inalagay yan sa ating saligang batas na hindi natin pahintulutan ang anumang armas nuklear dito sa ating teritoryo. Kaya nga, idagdag pa natin yan sa ating foreign policy na maliban sa mga naglalagay dito ng mga basing militar, ay talagang mariin nating pinagbabawal na magkaroon sila ng kakayanan magtayo ng mga armas na nuklear. Ayaw po natin ng ating bansa ay talagang mabura ng tuluyan. Kung papansin nyo, ito nakaraang digmaan pandaigdig ng makalawang digmaan pandaigdig, napulburan tayo ng Amerika, no? Talagang binugbog tayo ng mga bomba ng Amerika nung tinawagin nila Open City ang Manila. At mahigit 1 milyon o 2 milyong mga mamayang Pilipino ang namatay. No? Ang nakalagay pa nga sa ating pangalawang digmaang pandaigdig. At dahil nga dyan, ayaw po natin maulit yan. Kaya nga mariin inilagay ng ating mga nagsulat ng saligang batas itong 1987 na pilit natin huwag magtatayo ng itong armas nuklear dito. Kaya nga, meron tayong pangailangan sa pangalakal sa China at kailangan po natin ng China. Pero ganoon pa man, dapat igalang nila ang ating kalayaan na huwag nilang basta-basta aangkinin ang mga teritoryo dito malapit sa ating bansa. No? Ngayon, pakinggan po natin itong kahuli-hulihang ulat ni Justice Carpio. Mga ilang minuto na lang ito at matatapos na ang kanyang pag-uulat at intindihin po natin ang mga nangyayari sa kasalukuyang panahon.
So when the ruling came out, the US said, "We will sail and fly in the South China Sea." France said, "We will also sail and fly. We will ask our European neighbors to join us in a regular patrol in the South China Sea." The British said, "We will do the same. When our 2 aircraft carriers are finished, we will sail them in the South China Sea." Australia said, "We will continue to sail and fly in the South China Sea." Now, the tribunal made a specific finding on mischief reef. The tribunal said, "We find mischief reef is a low tide elevation. It's submerged at high tide, so it's low tide. You can see it only at low tide. And therefore, mischief reef has no territorial sea and cannot be owned because it's beyond the territorial sea of any state. And it forms part of the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines." So there is a clear categorical ruling by the tribunal that mischief reef has no territorial sea, no territorial airspace. It's part of the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. And as part of the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, it can only be exploited by the Philippines. Only the Philippines can put up structures there. If China is still there now, China is there as a squatter. Now, that's mischief reef. Huge. It's totally submerged at high tide in its natural state before the reclamation by China. Today, 3-kilometer military-grade runway, barracks for thousands of Marines. You have radars, structures there, entry and exit for warships and submarines. That's the runway in mischief reef. Any jet fighter here can reach Manila in less than 20 minutes, can reach Puerto Princesa in less than 10 minutes. The radar here can monitor any aircraft that lands or takes off in Puerto Princesa or in the entire Palawan area. So this air base and naval base, this is both an air and naval base, the Chinese call this their Pearl Harbor in the South China Sea. This is a dagger pointed at us because this mischief-reef air and naval base of China will be used by China to enforce the 9-dash line as China's national boundary. So when the ruling came out, the Americans decided to test. Because the ruling said mischief reef has no territorial sea, the US sailed this ship zigzag. Because if this were a territorial sea, this ship should sail straight line, continuous, without stopping. But to show to the Chinese here in Mischief Reef that this is not a territorial sea because it's an artificial island, they zigzag, they conducted man-overboard operations, they sent aloft their drones to prove. So they were actually enforcing the ruling for us. And this ship, the USS Giffords, sailed there again in November 16, recently, 2019, the same way, to show to the Chinese that this is not a territorial sea. They were enforcing the ruling. And this plane, the US Poseidon, which can detect submarines that are submerged and can drop torpedoes from the air, flew over Mischief Reef. And this was the conversation between the Chinese ground controller and the US aircraft. The Chinese ground controller said, "Leave immediately," to avoid any misunderstanding. The US aircraft said, "We are conducting lawful military activities beyond the national airspace of any coastal state." This is not a territorial airspace. We can fly here because there's freedom of overflight. This is part of the EEZ of the Philippines. So the Americans were enforcing the ruling for us, not because they love us, but because it's in their national interest to protect their sea lanes. Remember, of the 5.2 trillion trade of shipborne goods that traverse the South China Sea every year, over $1 trillion of that is U.S. inbound and outbound trade. They have to maintain freedom of navigation and overflight. The French, they have 2 naval ships that continuously sail in the South China Sea because they want to maintain a naval presence in all exclusive economic zones, because in the exclusive economic zones, there's freedom of navigation. The British, they have 2 naval ships also sailing continuously in the South China Sea because they want an unbroken presence in the South China Sea, because they want the rules to preserve the integrity of the rules-based international system. That's the code word for the ruling. They want to enforce the ruling without saying that we're enforcing the ruling. It's a euphemism for them, integrity of the rules-based international system. The Japanese have 2 helicopter carriers. Every year they alternate in sailing in the South China Sea. This dock in Subic, the last time it was here, I visited it, and I asked the captain of the ship, "Where in the South China Sea did you sail?" And he answered, "In the West Philippine Sea." That's our EEZ. "What did you do in the Philippine EEZ?" He said, "We sent aloft this helicopter." That's a military activity. They were telling China, this is an exclusive economic zone of a coastal state, and we have freedom of navigation here. The Indonesians, the Indians, they have, every year they send a naval task force in the South China Sea to assert freedom of navigation. The Canadians do the same every year to assert freedom of navigation. So all these naval powers actually enforce the ruling for us because they're showing to the Chinese that these are exclusive economic zones or high seas. Remember, China refuses to accept that there are exclusive economic zones in the South China Sea within the 9-dash line. These naval patrols of the naval powers rebut that forcefully. All this freedom of navigation and overflight operations are directed at China. This is not your waters. These are high seas or exclusive economic zones of other coastal states, and therefore we can sail here. So what should we as Filipinos do now? We should encourage all the navies of the world to sail in the South China Sea and in particular in the West Philippine Sea, so that they will enforce the ruling. Also, we should ask our neighbors, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei, to help us explain to the Chinese people that China never had historic rights in the South China Sea. It's totally false. And all of us in ASEAN should educate the world that China never had historic rights in the South China Sea. All these claims of China under the 9-dash line is totally false. We should continue resorting to the rule of law because we have no other choice. Why don't we have a choice? Well, our Constitution says we renounce war as an instrument of national policy, and we cannot enforce the ruling by going to war. We have to use the rule of law. And also the UN Charter prohibits war as a means, or use of force or threat of force as a means of settling territorial or maritime disputes. War or use of force or threat of force has been outlawed under the UN Charter. And under our own Constitution, what is the power of the President? Can the President declare war? No, he cannot even declare war. The power of the President is limited to calling the armed forces in case of invasion, but he cannot direct an aggression against another state. It's not one of his powers. Only if there is an invasion can he call out the armed forces. The power to declare war is lodged in Congress. Congress, by 2/3 vote of both houses in joint session assembled, voting separately, shall have the sole power to declare the existence of a state of war. That's our Constitution. So we must fight this battle with China. We must preserve our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea through the rule of law. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you for your patience and kind attention.
Okay, yan po tinapos po ni Justice Carpio. So, haharapin na po natin ang sitwasyon. Talagang wala na po tayong magagawa at talagang pinaligiran na po tayo ng bansang China sa ating mga teritoryo. Talagang nagtayo na sila ng mga infrastruktura. Pero ganoon pa man, kinikilala ng buong bansa, hindi lang ang ating bansa, kundi ang buong daigdig, yung mga, lalo na yung mga malalakas na bansa tulad ng Francois, ng UK, ng India, ng Japan, lalo ng Amerika, at ganoon din ng Australia, na sinasabi nila dahil nga ang pag-aari po nitong EEZ ay sa bansang Pilipinas at ganoon pa man, meron tayong tinutugunan na freedom of navigation, pwede silang tumawid at hindi nila kinikilala ang mischief reef na inaangkin ng bansang China. So habang tuluyan itong mga naval vessels ng ibang mga malalaking bansa, no? Walang mayayaring digmaan dito sa ating teritoryo kasi nga pinapakita nitong mga ibang bansa na kinikilala nila ng pag-aari nitong teritoryo ay nasa bansang Pilipinas at meron tayong layunin na hahayaan natin ang sinumang sasakyang pangdigmaan o sasakyang pangkalakalan na malayang tumawid dito, no? Meron yung tinatawag nilang, yan po ang nilalaman po ng economic exclusive zone. Hindi ibig sabihin akin lang ito. Ibig sabihin yan nasa pagkakilala sa pag-aari po ng bansang Pilipinas, pero dahil nga nilalagay sa exclusive economic zone, maluwag po ang pagdadaloy po niyan. Hindi po teritoryo po yan. Gaya na sinasabi ko sa inyo, yung ginagawa na hindi nila pwedeng angkinin as a coastal nation or a coastal state. Itong mischief reef na mismong inoccupy ng China. Kasi nga po, bahagi po siya ng ating archipelago. At dahil nga sa bahagi ng archipelago, may mga batas, may mga na hinahayaan at sino man dumaan dyan ng malaya na wala silang Kasi nga, karagatan nga yan eh. At kung tamaan ka naman ng bagyo, at ang pinakamalapit mong pwedeng silungan, itong isla na ito. Alanganin naman pagbabawalan ka nung na nakatayong infrastruktura doon. Hindi, dapat hayaan mo yun kasi nga kailangan ligtas at taong bayan kasi nga isa lang ang ating planeta. At ito ay parang kumbaga global citizenship. Kaya nga tuloy-tuluyan na nga itong ganun pa man na wala tayong kakayanan na lumaban at makipagharapan dito sa bansang China. Pero dahil nga sa binuong kasunduan dito sa United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea at yung paliwanag na ano ang tinuturing nilang economic exclusive zone at yung mga territorial claims ay nakalagay na dyan at ano yung mga pwedeng kanya-kanyang mga rules and responsibilities bilang isang soberanong bansa, yun na po ang kumbaga pinapaitulutan sa atin. Kaya maganda pa naman ang pangyayaring ito. Ngayon, sa ganito sitwasyon tayo, isa sa mga panukalang tinutulak dito sa Katipunan Demokratikong Pilipino, maliban na ipaloob na sa ating estado itong mga public utilities galing sa mga oligarko, ilagay sana itong mga oligarko dito sa kalakalan ng paggagawa ng mga armas. Sana naman po ang dadating na administrasyon ay bigyan ng pondo ang defense spending. Kung itong administrasyon, itong kasalukuyan na pamahalaan ay nagbigay ng pansin sa paggagawa ng mga infrastruktura gaya ng gagawa ng mga kalsada at mga tulay, kulang pa ho yan. Sana po magtayo rin sila ng nuclear reactor o kaya ng mga solar farms dito sa ating bansa. Pero kailangan po yan ibalik na sa pag-aari pangasiwa ng Estado at ibaba ang singil sa abot kaya ng mamamayan para hindi naman talaga, para yun itutugunan sa ating kahirapan at talagang lumaya na tayo sa pangangailangan. Hanggang ngayon talagang gipit na ang taong bayan, lalo-lalo ito sa pandemya. Walang tigil ng pagtataas ng presyo ng kuryente, walang tigil ng pagtataas ng presyo ng tubig at ganoon din ang walang tigil ng pagtataas ng presyo ng gasolina. At ganoon din ang telekomunikasyon. Samantala ang serbisyo naman nila ay kahina-hina. Meron naman paraan na ayusin ito at talagang kung talagang mamarapatin nila, tutuparin nila ang nakasaad dito sa ligang batas, ay dapat nga ibalik na po muli yan, yung mga ganyang klaseng kalakalan sa pamamahala at pamangasiwa ng ating estado, ng ating pamahalaan. At meron naman tayong mga training institutions katulad ng Development Academy of the Philippines na pwedeng bigyan ng training or education or kasanayan itong mga naglilingkod sa ganyan-ganyan public utilities, or meron din tayong kakayanan katulad ng National College of Public Administration and Governance, yung po yung State College. Meron din po tayong General Staff College para sa mga general, maging professional po ang ating mga kasundaluhan, or National Defense College para lumakas po ang ating kakayanan sa depensa. No? Meron din mga training din yung Public Safety College, Philippine Public Safety College para sa mga kapulisan. Marami po tayo mga establishmento na pwedeng bigyan ng proper training and education. Itong ating nalalagay sa ating hukbong sandatang ng lakas. No? At sana damihan pa ng ating mga darating na administrasyon at gawing professional itong Armed Forces of the Philippines. Damihan pa, lalo-lalo na ang Navy, Philippine Navy, ganoon din ang Philippine Coast Guard at ganoon din ang ating Philippine Air Force. Kasi nga, yan lang ang pwedeng talagang makibantay ng ating, hindi para makipagdigmaan, kundi para bantayin lang ang ating teritoryo. At ganoon din, at bigyan ng pagtatanggol, ipagtanggol ng ating mga mangingisda at ang ating mga sakyang pangkaragatan galing po dito sa ating bansa. No? Nasa ganoon ay talagang alam natin na tayo iligtas at tayo talaga may sariling kapakanan na ipaglaban ng ating sarili nating mamamayan. Huwag lang po tayo talagang isusuko natin ang ating soberano, hindi lang dito sa mga dayuhan at ganoon dito sa mga oligarko. Itigil na po itong pang-abuso at pangangalipin ng mga oligarko sa mga mamamayan. Tanggalin na po sila. Pang-awa na lang po, Panginoon Diyos. Kung maaari na lang po, ito po yung danalangin po namin sa inyong Panginoon na sana po itugunan niyo itong ating panalangin dahil talagang hirap na hirap nitong bansa na makaraan na po ang mahigit 35 taon mula nung napatalsik po si Pangulong Marcos at nakikita po ng ating sambayanan na talagang walang paraan na gumana o umahon na ito kung hindi talagang naluluklok lang tayo sa mga pagnanakaw at pagdadarambong ng mga nakaraang administrasyon. Ganun pa rin hanggang sa kasalukuyan. Wala pa rin kaming nawawalan na po ng tiwala ang ating mga mamayan sa nangyari sa ngayon. Ganun pa man, nananawagan pa rin ng Katipunan Demokratikong Pilipino na sana ay magbago na itong arbitration dahil mali-mali talaga ang mga panukala, lalo-lalo na itong sa pandemyang ito na alam natin ay maling-mali na at lalo tayong ang ating ekonomiya ay lalo lang lumulubog at tila nagbubulag-bulagan at tila na talagang nagbibingian ang mga nasa paligid ni Pangulong Duterte at mismo Pangulong Duterte ay nadadala sa mga pabuyan itong mga pambulahan o mga lukuhan itong mga kalihim niya. Kaya nga ito nga isa pang dagok sa administrasyon ni Pangulong Duterte, ito paano niya tutugunan na lumalalang sitwasyon dito sa ating teritoryo. Okay, dito na muna tayo itatapos itong ating paksa patungkol dito sa Usaping Teritoryo at sa United Nations Conference on the Laws of the Sea. Babasahin po natin ang mga komento niya ng nasusubaybay dito. Ayon po ito po galing po kay Wilfredo Opiano, bumabati po ng magandang hapon sa mabuhay po ang KDP. Ganoon niya nakaraang Martes ang Zoom live daw ni Ambassador Alberto Encomienda. Mabuti naman napurod niyo yung buong talakayan nito. Marami kayong mapupulot dyan sa kanilang Zoom. At ako'y ilanyayahan yung mga sumusubaybay nito. Panoorin niyo po yan pong Zoom live ni Ambassador Alberto Encomienda. Marami kayong matutunan. Galing po to kay Ernie Ocampo, mabati po sa atin ng magandang hapon at mabuhay, at ganoon din sa KDP, sa Kamao at buong bansang Pilipinas. Galing po naman ito kay Lurag RJ, mabati po ng magandang hapon. Salamat po sa inyo. Kay Blanca Magada, Marcos lang ang solusyon, at meron po siyang inaalok ditong Facebook page. Kay Jorge de los Reyes, ipaglaban ang ating kasarinlan, laban sa dayuhan, huwag paaabuso, laban tayo sa China. Kung hindi tayo lalaban, magiging alipin tayo. Tama po yan, Jorge, pero sa kasalukuyan, mahina po ang ating hukbong sa datang lakas. Kaya kailangan po gumawa tayo ng panukala, itulak po natin na tanggalin na po ang pangangasit, pag-aari ng mga public utilities at mga ganoon din ang gasolina toll roads sa oligarko. At itong mga oligarko, ilipat naman sila sa defense industry, no? At magkaroon naman tayo ng pagbubuhos ng pondo na palakasin ang ating pambansang depensa. At ganoon din po kay Wilma Manzanillo. Nagpapasalamat po siya. Kay Mr. EXID, nagpabati po ng magandang hapon. Kay Lourdes Kak, magandang hapon, magandang araw po sa iyo. Magandang araw din, salamat. Ang bansa natin ay sobrang inapi ng mga banyaga, ayon dito kay Lourdes Kak. At mapanghanggang ngayon ay nangyayari pa rin. Ang mga Koreano ata ay nandyan na rin sa Pilipinas. Sabi ng mga pinsan niya, mula daw nung pumutok ang Vulcan Pinatubo. Hindi lang po ang Koreano, Lourdes, pati na rin ang mga in-check. Marami na po dito sa ating bansa. Nagkalat na po. Ganun din po kay dagdag pa ni Lourdes Cal, ay naku po, wala na talagang kaunlaran hanggat nandyan ang mga traidor sa bayan. Money na lang, pera-pera na lang, nakapakalungkot daw, sabi nga ni Lourdes Cal. Kay Zenea Arcilia, mabati po ng magandang hapon. Listeners, keep safe po sa inyong lahat. Okay? Kay Axiboy Lifestyles, bakit nagbebenta Pilipinas ng dolomite na pagtambak para gawing isla? Hindi lang mga isla at reef ang binenta dyan, pati yung bundok natin. Tinatakpan nyo pa yung hudas na Tridorte na yan. Oo nga eh. Axiboy, tila hindi lang kay Duterte nangyari po ito. I think nangyari po ito mula pa kay Noy o kundi kaya kay Gloria, nagbukas sila ng mga pananambak o pagkukuha ng ating pag-acquire ng ating natural resources. Kaya nga nung kinuha nga si Gina Lopez, maraming tumutol sa kanya. Hindi nga nagtagal, napatatsik pa nga siya. Kawawa naman siya, namatay. Bago tayo makipagpatayan sa mga halimaw sa laban ng bahay, pugutan muna dapat ang mga ahas sa loob ng bahay. Treason yan, pagbibenta ng mga dolomite. Walang magagawang isla dyan kung walang dolomite. Ayan po ay ayon kay Axiboy Lifestyles. Galing naman po to kay Lito Odretni. Magandang hapon po. Be safe, sir. Thank you. Kay Axiboy Lifestyles, smart as ba yan na nilalagay naman sa peligro ang Pilipinas? Treason yan. Kay traidoran yan. Ewan ko sa inyo. Sobra naman kayo kung di kayo nakakalata sa double talk yung ginagawa ni Duterte. Panot na lang kayo ng panot. Totoo nga bang bintang yan si Panot? Pero hanggang ngayon, patuloy ang bentahan dyan. Lahat sila ay nagbenta. Siguro, simula kay Gloria. Pero wag nyo naman takpan yung si Duterte. Ang totoo niyan, mula pa nung panahon po ni Cory hanggang sa kalukuyan, itong mga naging Pangulo ay meron silang sariling kumaga buto sa kanilang cabinet. Skeletons in their cabinet, no? In their closet. At wala naman sa kanilang santito, santita. May mga kasalanan din yan sa taong bayan. Kaya huwag mo nating pinupuri itong mga kasalukuyan na pinuno, kundi manawagan po tayo ng tuluyan at tamaan na po yung pagnanakaw nyo. Mula pa kay Cory, mula pa kay Ramos, kay Erap, kay Gloria, kay Noynoy at kasalukuyan kay Duterte. Pare-pares na po silang mga nag-aangabuso at nagsasamantala sa atin. Galing naman po ito kay Zenea Arcilia, Sir Toti, kagagawan na yan lahat ng mga nakaraang administrasyon mula kay Cory, Gloria at Ramos. Totoo po yan, Zenea. Talagang marami po talaga nagsamantala nung napatalsik po si Pangulong Marcos. Hindi lang po sa ating mga Pangulo, hanggang sa baba, hanggang sa mga mayor, hanggang sa barangay, may mga nagnanakaw po. Nung panahon po ni Marcos, walang nakawan kasi nga ang control po ng budget ay centralized. At yung batasan pambansa, wala po silang yung mga mambabatas doon, wala po silang countrywide development fund or pork barrel. Dahil nga dito, kailangan na tanggalin na nga yung pork barrel sa ating mga mambabatas. Galing po kay Gatsby Talco, doble cara si Digong. Galing naman to kay Isko, lahat ng lumipas ng administrasyon, pinahina ang militar, nagnanakawan, tapos lahat kay Presidente Duterte, pinipilit na bawiin, maraming gago. Oo nga, atin yan, kunin mo yan. Ngayon sa China, Ganito naman kay Alfredo Ordina, President Carpio's wife is Vietnamese. Ayaw bakbakan ang Vietnam. Okay, kay Ernie Ocampo, it was China to blame all of this because they are too abusive in their territorial claims, including our territorial sea. Puro ka economic zones, wala ka namang panggasolina man lang sa mga barko mo. Kay L. John Lucas de la Cruz, what to do? Ginoong Carpio, ihanda ang sumpit mo, sumpit ko. Ganon din po kay Malval, mabati po. So sa inyong mga sa inyong mga komento, nakita po natin na marami po tayong huwag na po tayo magtalo. Ako talaga, nagsawa na ako. Sa totoo lang, ayoko na magmumura. Talagang wala nang mangyayari dito sa talagang punayin na lang natin yung mga kamalian ng ating nanunungkulan. Huwag natin basta tatanggapin sila, huwag natin basta pinupuri. Kasi trabaho nila po yan eh. Hindi dapat sila binibigyan ng pagpupuri o tinataas sila. Kasi nga, kaya nga sila nilagay dyan sa ating pamalaan para paglingkuran tayo. Di ba sinasabi nga ni Pangulong Noynoy na kayo ang boss ko, ibig sabihin na taong bayan ang boss niya. Okay, tamang panawag, tamang pananalita yun. Pero ginagampanan ba nila? Hindi. Kaya nga, huwag po tayo magpapapadala sa mga ginagawa ng ito mga namumuno, maging sila ay mayor, governor, or presidente. Sila po ay tinatawag natin public servant. Ibig sabihin po nila, ang nililingkuran nila, tayo mga mamamayan. Tayo po nagpapasweldo sa kanila, gawa po ng buwis. Kaya nga, huwag na natin po pinupuri itong mga kusino-sino mga yan. Yung mga pinasawag nilang ran, sararan, o tinutulak si BBM. Wala naman na talaga tayong atraso dyan. Ang punto lang po, intindihin po natin ng mabuti. Sila po ay talagang nilalagay natin sa ating pamalaan para paglingkuran tayo ngayon. Tayo naman mga mamamayan ay magbigay ng ating sariling pananaw kung anong dapat gawin nitong mga nunungkulan. Gaya nitong issue nito sa South China Sea or West Philippine Sea, ang ating panukala dito sa Katipunan Democratic Republic ay palaguin ang paggagastos ng ating defense, no? Sa ating buhusan ng pondo itong defense, at ganoon din bigyan sila ng proper training. Buhusan din po ng tamang gastos ang ating edukasyon, no? At itong infrastruktura natin, lalo itong telekomunikasyon, bawiin na po yan sa estado. Mismo ang ating estado, ang National Telecommunications Commission, ang magtatag ng mga fiber optics sa buong bansa. Yung mga ginawang build. Pwede kabitan ng fiber optics, lahat yan. Ha? Pag fiber optics na po ginamit po natin, ligtas po yan sa mga electronic magnetic field na tinutulak ng mga pribado. Itong 5G na alam natin ay masama sa kalusugan. Marami na hong lumalabas na aral na ito po'y nakakasama. Pero ganoon pa man, binabaliwala nito mga dambuhan ng mga negosyante at mga dambuhan ng kalakalan at pilit na ito din nakakabuti. Hindi. Pag yan po, malakas nga po ang kanyang signal at para po tayo nilagay sa microwave. At yan po ay pag dumidikit sa ating ulo, magkakaroon po tayo ng mga kuno ng mga klaseng kasakitan, maski magkakaroon tayo ng neural defects or ganoon din ng mga cancer. Kaya nga, unawain po natin, suriin ang mabuti itong mga nangyayari sa paligid. Yan, katulad yung bakuna na yan at yung mga gamot kung ang dapat natin gamitin. At dahil nga dito, kailangan maging maayos ang ating kapaligiran, maayos ang ating kalusugan, maayos ang ating kinakain, at sa ganoon ay maging masigla at malakas ang ating tao. Hindi tayo dapat hahayaan itong mga kusino-sino mga miron na baka matakapwes sila, hindi po sila magagaling, hindi po sila eksperto. Sila po ay katulong lamang, servant lang po sila. Ang kanilang pinaglilingkuran ay tayong tao, yung taong bayan. Kaya nga dapat tayo magkaisa na. Tama na itong mga hudwaan natin sa isa't isa. At sana po ay kilalanin po natin ang ating lakas ay kung tayo nagkakaisa. Kung tayo hati-hati, talagang mahina tayo at yung mga nanungkulan, aabusuhin po tayo. Hanggang dito na lang po ang ating pahayag. Papaalam na po ako. Ito ang lingkod, Toti Casiño. Maraming salamat po sa sumaybay sa programang ito. Ang tabayan ninyo sunod na programa, Ang Sulong sa Pilipinas, handog sa inyo ng Katipunan Channel, atid ni RJ Abeliana. Maraming salamat po.